today we're very fortunate, it's an honor that Yossi Shain is with us. He's going to speak on, the title of this talk is The Reaction of Different Sectors of the Jewish Community to the Rise of Anti-Semitism in the United States. And I'll just say, I told Yossi this earlier, I was at UCLA when he gave a talk, and I've actually never heard, ever, a scholar or an expert on the American Jewish community to understand so many nuances and layers of the Jewish community. So here Yossi speaks. I think we're in for a treat. Yossi is the Romulo Bentecourt Professor of Political Science at Tel Aviv University, where he's also the chairman of the Political Science Department, and he's the head of the Abba Eben Graduate Studies Program in Diplomacy. He's also the director of the Francis Brody Institute for Applied Diplomacy. He's also a full professor of comparative government and diaspora politics at Georgetown University, and he is the founding director of the program of Jewish Civilization at Georgetown, which was a unique and important center. It's amazing that you pulled that off. An amazing accomplishment. Yossi in 2007 was also the president of the Western Galilee College. He did his BA and Master's in Political Science at Tel Aviv University, and then he went on to do his doctorate in Political Science and gained it with distinction at Yale. He has many books and articles and credit, and he's around the media as an expert all over the world. He's lectured all over the world. He's working on two important books now, and very interesting, on the Israelization of Judaism. And another book that he's working on now is Israel's Century. He's written books including the marketing the American creed abroad, and he's also worked on kinship diaspora and many other books and articles. Really a prominent scholar. It's an honor that you're here. Thank you for coming, and appropriate that this is like the final home run lecture. So
thank you so much for being here. It's an honor being here. You've been hearing lots of speakers, and I know by now you are all, and you are yourself scholars, and so it's a challenge to challenge you. But I will try to do my best in raising some issues that perhaps have been raised before because I haven't been here, but to give them an elaboration the way I see it in terms of the questions that should be asked and the challenges that we have not only as practitioners but also as scholars and thinkers about some of these issues. I begin by saying, and this is just a first observation, that we are in a very peculiar moment in Jewish history. It's the first time in history of the Jews where the sovereign state of Israel is informing almost everything that's Jewish. Israel is fast becoming not only the most important factor in Israel's Jewish life, but also for the first time in history perhaps, the majority of the Jews will reside in Israel in 10 years, which is quite remarkable. We have about 13.5 million Jews, or maybe 14 million, and by 2022 or 2025, depends on the census, all indications are that Israel will become not only the plurality of the Jews, already we are having 45% of the Jews are in Israel, but the majority of the Jews, which means a shift in terms of the, I would say, the paradigm of the Jewish people from a nation of exiles or a nation of diaspora only 100 years ago to a sovereign people informed by sovereignty more than anything else. And Charles mentioned the books I've been working on with my colleague Dr. Kassif. We're writing 2 volumes, heavy volumes of the history of the Jews right now, where we're basically discussing these paradigms from antiquity to modernity, seeing the shifts, what we call the Israelization of Judaism, and the importance of sovereignty as a point that is a very interesting point to reach. As a result of that also, or I don't know the result of that, but certainly influenced by that development, we also no longer have a Jewish question in the world. Very little Jewish question. Jewish question has informed the world for many, many generations. It has informed the world in terms of theology, in terms of modernity, in terms of issues related to psychology, sociology, identity, etc., etc. We are more gearing toward the Israeli question, including in anti-Semitism. The very essence of anti-Semitism has rotated to a large extent from what we call traditional anti-Semitism to the Israelization of anti-Semitism. I've written extensively about it, which is also a very important point to remember, related to this shift that occurred in the Jewish world only in the past 70 years, which is also quite remarkable. Just to give you some data, which is important to remember, Israel is the fastest growing country in terms of birth rates than any other Western country in the world by far. Israelis deliver babies 3.19 per woman on average. No other Western country even come near to this number. And the longevity in Israel is 84.3, whatever the 0.3 for women, 81, 82 for men, which means that they live long, they deliver babies a lot, and they're also happy, which is quite weird. On the indexes of happiness, Israelis are ranked very high on happiness. So they also take lots of Ritalin and Prozac, whatever they do it well. So this is a very important, this is of course in conjunction with the sharp decline of productivity in terms of babies in the Western world, especially among liberal Jews. And this of course does not include the ultra-Orthodox Jews, which are fast growing also in the United States. The only segment which is very much growing in numbers in the United States. And this is also an important factor to remember. So as I said, we have moved from the old Jewish question, which we'll see what was the question, to the new Jewish question. The old Jewish question was about the designation of people with tremendous power, notwithstanding their powerlessness. The new Jewish question is a designation of the Jewish people with power, sometimes overwhelming power, in terms of the sovereign state, in terms of the sovereign state in conjunction with Jewish diaspora, sometimes with the United States in that respect, as people were thinking about, for example, Jewish Americans in Walter Mearsheimer's book, sort of the Jewish lobby, something which is kind of like overwhelming power. This idea of overwhelming power is part and parcel of the question about the designation of the Jews. And that is, of course, an important point in remembering the very question that we are asking about anti-Semitism. Where does it come from? It used to come from all sorts of other issues, for example, theology. But theology has been in decline, significant decline. The question of Jewry in terms of like the relation to Christianity, for example, has undergone tremendous change. Look just only at the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church has changed its face vis-à-vis the Jewish people in the most remarkable fashion, not only since the Nostra Aetate in 1965, but ever since. And it's a revolutionary moment in the Christian church. As I speak to many people in the Christian church, writing about Christian Jewish relations, they tell me that this has been the most fundamental shift in the church since the Lutheran time, vis-à-vis Israel. And that's something one has to take into consideration. Why is that? In that respect, the very fact that the Pope Franciscus is coming to Jerusalem and laying a wreath on Herzl's tomb, one should not underestimate this moment, because as you very well know, the loss of sovereignty of the Jews was always interpreted as the loss of the selection of the Jews by God, historically speaking, and the transformation of that selection to Christianity, to the Christians. And here, of course, when Herzl comes to Pope Pius X and asks him to recognize Zionism, of course, he sent him away and said, you know, you have not selected our prophet, our Messiah, and how can I do so? The very fact that Israel is now recognized by the church as the sole spokesman for the Jewish people is quite a remarkable phenomenon, and that is part and parcel also of the shifts that has undergone or took place in the Catholic Church. That has taken place in light of also many of the things that you have described, or you have described in the seminar, about the geopolitics of the world, where the world is. And where the world is where Christianity is, vis-à-vis Islam, vis-à-vis the religion, etc., etc. And that is also a very important indication of the shift taking place.
And that has tremendous repercussions for the very question of the Jewish question, which is the old question, which is, theologically speaking, has been in decline, significant decline. It doesn't mean it disappears. It never disappears. But it has no longer anymore a Christian church sanctification in that respect. And that's an important point to be remembered. There is also a question which was raised at the last speaker, and you made some distinctions about the Jews and Israel, and I think the gentleman here was asking about it, and as you were asking, I was thinking about it. And Charles, you answered about this kind of like relations between to Israel and to the Jewry. It's interesting enough that there is a tremendous love of Israel, let alone, of course, among evangelicals, among certain segments of the Christian to Israel. It doesn't have to relate to the Jewish people. Sovereignty of Israel has been respected in that respect in a powerful manner, that it doesn't matter whether in the end of the day you expect Israel to be converting to Christianity. You know, when I spoke once to the head of the Anti-Defamation League, Foxman, and I said, you know, like, you support these guys that in the end of the day want to convert all of us. He said, that's exactly why I speak to them, because they want to do it in the end of the day, and I live now. And he said, so we have to have allies now. At the end of the day, we'll see when we get there. And that is something which is very much part and parcel of this discussion. It is not, therefore, by mistake that you see this kind of rupture, for example, in the American public. The right wing in America is very supportive of Israel. Anti-Semitism, when he spoke in America, is related to the Jews. It is not related to Israel, which is quite an interesting development. It doesn't mean that there will be love there. It doesn't mean that it can change in a bit, and so on. But this is something which exists, and it exists also in Eastern Europe. We talked about it this morning over breakfast. You can have tremendous relations with Israel now in Eastern Europe. And Netanyahu coming to meet the leaders of Eastern European countries. I had 2 essays this week in the papers. You can see one of them I saw translated to English. The second probably will be translated. I write for Yediot Achronot columns and the daily, and they translate to English. And it's quite remarkable to see this kind of like nexus almost with East European countries. But when the issue of anti-Semitism arises, it separates Israel from anti-Semitism in that respect. Israel is not the object of the anti-Semitism. Whether it will be quickly intertwined, that's a different story, and why. But this is a very important point to be remembered as a starting point of our analysis today. It is important also in understanding American Jewry, in understanding the shifts in American Jewry, in understanding at all the evolution of Judaism and anti-Semitism. Because anti-Semitism, as you study it, is a phenomena which relates to the vulnerabilities of the Jews, to the vulnerabilities, to the categorization, stigmatization, etc., etc., etc. Now, there is a lot of things related to Jewish power about anti-Semitism. How much power you have assigned to Jews, as they said. Jewish power is something which is constantly with us, and it always have been assumed there is lots of Jewish power. Even at a time when Jews were completely powerless, there's always a subject of power, or too much power. And how much this power can be for debased people, historically speaking, as they were debased in terms of the Christian sort of like theology, the Christian existence. Less so perhaps in a different fashion in the Islamic world with Dahimi and so on, so like less kind of categorized in that language. But Jewish power is a very interesting case. It is related also to the Jewish self-definition of power. We discussed before the question of monotheism. You mentioned that subject. Monotheism is a very interesting development of the Jewish people. It's an ingenious idea, and historically no one knows when it was invented. Some people make the reference it was invented, and we have a scholar here of Bayit Sheni, but during the Babylonian exile was Ezra and Nehemiah. The question is why it was invented. Some of the interpretation which I take as part of the scholarship is that this was the designation as a result of the exile, the first exilic moment, which is 586 BC. The first exilic moment in Jewish history, because we have less and less historical evidence about the period of the Davidic kingdom, Solomon and so on, which is 10 BCE. But then we start to see this kind of like the idea of the moving of the Jewish people into Babylon, which is a short exile. And there are two variations of interpretation to that. One was a disastrous moment in Jewish history. על נהרות בבל שם ישבנו שם בכינו בזוכרנו את ציון. On the banks of Babylon, we were sitting and weeping as we memorize Zion. And then there is, of course, Jeremiah's prophecy to tell them, go, dwell, enjoy, build houses, be part of them. This kind of like contradiction. And there is also an interpretation to that. It's the first time that we have the interpretation of what we call the monotheistic interpretation of God. That God losing wars in the ancient Middle East or the ancient Near East has not longer part of the Jewish tradition. For the Jews, God is a theodicy. It's kind of a something across time. It's an historical God. It's an Hegelian God. Something which has a plan. And the plan is unknown. If we have a plan, we have all the power in the world. Therefore, our own exile is a result of our deeds. It's a punishment for what we did. The Jews have empowered themselves in many ways in order to preserve the tribe while in exile, while creating two things. One is monotheism, and the other is Zera HaKodesh. The tribal idea of we are connected, maintaining the tribe and all other tribe. Therefore, all the laws of Tuma, all the laws to prevent idbolelut, assimilation, that you cannot be with other women, and you can, and so on, so forth, and so forth. So there is maintaining the tribe and maintaining the tribe in the absence of sovereignty. In the absence of sovereignty, you're creating rotating nation by adopting God and creating the narrative of that nature. And that God will yield miracles, and you will come back to your home. And that is a God which is overwhelmingly powerful. He reads, he's the God of all nations, but he selected us. And this selection is a massive, massive, powerful idea that puts the Jews at the epic center of international politics. The Jews have always been at the epic center of international politics. In terms of morality, in terms of sovereignty, in terms of identity, in terms of the very creation. This in and of itself creates kind of a sense of who the hell they are in terms of their power. What attributes this kind of power to the people who are so powerful? Now, some of this can get to megalomaniac idea that we are the powerful, that we are the epic center of the world. Some of the Israelis think that we are the epic center of the world. Anything happened, it happened here. So when the world happens, it's irrelevant, but when we happen, it's relevant. And Israelis like to, in many ways, to convey this message. This language has, to some people, look at them and say, what the heck is that? But there is also a question here of history and of religiosity, of the contribution of the Jews. The Jews, in that respect, have become a people that took over certain spheres of knowledge. They took over morality. If you look at any debates about morality, the Jews are there. If it's the Reform Jews, will take over the idea of tikkun olam, as a sort of repairing the world, universal morality. If it's the question of egalitarianism, it will be the socialism. The Jews have taken over socialism. The Jews have had this tremendous capacity to inject themselves with the concept of power, or the lack of it, have been completely available to them. And the reason has been because of the vagaries of life, the inability to decide between sovereignty and the lack of sovereignty, between this life that is of all other nations, dwelling like all other nations, and the life of being sort of like or lagoim, light into the nations. As you remember, the Jews have three paradigms of thinking. One is a nation who dwells alone. People who dwells alone. Am levadad yishkon. It's a paradigm. We are always am levadad yishkon. This is a paranoia, which may be right, may be wrong, doesn't matter, but we are alone, and we have to take care of our business. The second is am kechol ha'amim, a people like all other people, which means we are just like all other nations. This is kind of the Zionist dream. Let's just be the people like all other people. Normality. And then there is or lagoim, light into the nations, we are sort of like hovering above. In that respect, we have a mission, and this mission has moral mission, historical mission, etc. All of this is really creating the Jews in the epicenter, and it is when you look at Netanyahu's speech last week in Eastern Europe, when he tells the Europeans, we don't know if you will exist, but we certainly exist, and anyone who doesn't have business with us, maybe will not survive. And then he said it's a joke, because it's also a Jewish trait. It's bragging, and then, ooh, we are vulnerable. We're constantly bragging, but we're constantly vulnerable. So this is also part of this kind of like the idea. Are we so magnitude, or are we so vulnerable? And the vulnerability and the magnitude are part and parcel of Jewish psyche. Jews have been, historically speaking, coming from tremendous, I would say, calamity, to tremendous kind of like triumphant moment. We can do it. And you can see it in every junction of history. Even though they have been suffering tremendously, they have risen very rapidly to demand, in their minds at least, that something will happen. Jews, of course, never explain wars as wars with others and never lose wars. When Jews have lost wars to the Romans, to the Persians, easily explainable. We are political scientists. I am political scientist. You have an empire, they conquer you. Who the hell you are? No, they did not conquer us. We betrayed God. God used them as their rod. They came and they conquered us. So history is explained by our deeds, not by their power. All of this, ladies and gentlemen, puts the Jews in a very important place in world history, with tremendous contribution in each and other juncture. And as a result of the dispersion, you are sitting here at Oxford, hearing lots of things about anti-Semitism here and there, if it's in Brussels, if it's in France, if it's in England, if it's in the Arab world, in the Islamic world. It's also related to the dispersion. Each gets its own sort of variation of the big theme of the Jewish people. Therefore, when I was invited by Charles to come here, and he tells me to talk about the United States, it's important to know that the United States, of course, is the second largest community in the world now. It used to be, until most recently, the largest community in the world. And it's also the most powerful in terms of the diasporas. Nowadays, there is a question of the division of labor vis-a-vis Israel as the sovereign, powerful state, and the diaspora as the second to Israel. And this is indeed a very important development. But it's also, remember, that the United States, as we will see, as I will speak about it now, has invented this incredible model of Jewish life, which has been transformed for the first time in history, perhaps, the sovereignty of the people into the golden Medina. The United States itself provided the Jews not only a shelter, it provided the golden Medina, the golden state. It provided sovereignty and a home we can call home, and we can shape this home in our own image. We are at home, just as the United States saw itself as the New Jerusalem. So the Jews could see in the United States the New Jerusalem. They have tried to do so before. They believe they can do it before in modernity. And that was in Germany, of course. In Germany, anyone, and we have scholars here of modern France. In modern France, they less were trying to do so because they could not. In modern France, of course, which kind of like initiated the emancipation. And the emancipation in Germany took place a long time. It didn't take place at all, some would argue. In France, it did take place already after the French Revolution. But very quickly, in 1808, as you very well know, Napoleon kind of created the consistoire. The consistoire was designation of the Jews as Bnei Dat Israel, as a way of sort of designating them because people warned them about them. They could not claim Frenchhood as France as our home in the same fashion. They still were designated as religious segment. And that happened in 1808. 1808 is an important factor in France. France, of course, had many ways of looking at that. And the Jews have been trying to be part of France until Herzl, sort of like the Dreyfus affairs, was kind of brought modern idea of Zionism as part of anti-Semitism. Herzl was coming with the idea of anti-Semitism as the vehicle of defining the modern Jewish nation. They do not want us. We are always being rejected. Here we are. But France was not. In Germany, for example, you see from the 18th century attempts and big debates going on in Germany among the theologians, among politicians, because Germany itself was, of course, divided into numerous states. And the big question of Jews in Germany was a very important factor. Jews in Germany, if you know or not, were a very important subject, for example, for the Vienna Conference. I was looking lately for my book at all the data for the Vienna Conference. I was shocked to see that 2 weeks in Vienna, Metternich and Humboldt are dealing only with the Jews. Only with the Jews. 2 weeks were given to the Jews. I don't know how many of you knew it. It's my secret. It's amazing documents. And why do they do so? Because they discover that this is a question, the Jewish question is related to many of the states and to Germans' own sort of like history, what will happen. Therefore, they are dealing with it. It's the only designated minority. There are no other minorities. And the Jews themselves, from Mendelssohn on, were trying to be part and parcel of Germany, united Germany, taking over the very idea of Germanhood. All the way to the 20th century, where the idea was really unmashing the Reform Judaism, which was created in Germany, saying that Jewish religion is part and parcel of Lutheran German religion. That's what they did. And even after the Hap riot, and even after you just name it, this progression has been amazing. German Jews in the early part of the 19th century are the bottom of German society, with no representation, nothing. By the late 19th century, they are the upper echelon in every aspect of German society. Fast growing. Hate did never end. It just shifted. It got kind of like new interpretation, all the way to the racial interpretation, which grew and was faster. But they were there feeling that they want to be Germans, they want to serve in the German army, they want to be loyal to the state, and they saw themselves. Many of them, of course, converted to Christianity, just to get sort of like the Jewish identity altogether. America was the place, the Golden Medina, where this vision could be achieved in the end. It's not in France, it's not in England here of course not. Cromwell, of course, was giving the Jews entry back after they were kicked out. But the Jews will always live here behind walls in that respect, in England. And they were always designated, because England was also an Anglican church country, as a religious minority. Rabbi Merthers, here in England, is the head of the Jewish community religiously wise. Just to tell you about this process of Israelization, 100 rabbis in the British Commonwealth. All of them, without any exception, have been trained in Israel. Only 20 years ago, they were all trained in England. Complete Israelization of British Jewry, let alone complete Israelization of French Jewry. I don't know if you read my essays in the Jewish Review of Books on the Israelization of French Jewry. We did 2 years in France, we even filmed, but it's undeniable that French Jewry, in terms of identity, is completely enmeshed with Israel. No model of diaspora model in France built on French Jewish identity. When French talk about French books, they talk about Amos Oz, Aleph Bet Yoshua. No more French Jewish, Eliat Abu Kassis is Eliat Abu Kassis writing about her kids with Iraq already moving in Sukkot to Israel. A tremendous phenomenon of Israelization of the diaspora. At the same time, the question of Israel is becoming important, but there is, of course, the American scene. The American scene, ladies and gentlemen, and we can start from the end, because the end is always very funny. We have a very funny time. Some can say it's so funny that you want to cry, but it's funny in that respect. I remember I was covering the elections in the United States for Israeli TV 1, and they sent me to cover the Trump campaign. The night of the Trump, this is amazing story. The night of the elections, they sent the anchorman to downtown to Javits Center. His name is Jacob Elon, because they were expecting Hillary to win. And said, okay, you will go there, 53 and 6, next to the Hilton Hotel. This is the Trump headquarters. At 8 o'clock, everybody was waiting for the results. If Florida goes Hillary, the whole thing collapsed. But Florida didn't go Hillary. They were waiting for the results. They were only counting several percentage. We could not. And my friend called me and said, Yossi, let's go to Lexington, let's have dinner. So I go to Lexington and have dinner. Then a friend of ours, during dinner, 9:30 in the evening, this I left at 8, looks at the Israeli Ynet news, which is the Yediot Achronot news. He said, wow, Trump is leading. I was running back to the 53rd and 6th, and who did I see in front of the Trump, the Hilton Hotel? Israeli flags with ultra-Orthodox. And I said, wow, I have pictures if anyone wants. They're the only one who were there. Chanting like the Likud members chanting, Hu ha-makara, someone is achalota, which means they won. Funny, but kind of like, I don't think I said, unbelievable. Now, the jokes about, before the elections, that whatever happened in the White House, there will be a Jewish grandchild. For Hillary, there is a Jewish grandchild. Trump, of course, there is a Jewish grandchild. So the results are clear. There is a one. So, but grandchild, whatever happens, there is a grandchild. And if Bernie Sanders would won, oh yeah. So it was quite hilarious, you know, like the jokes. What is the difference between Donald Trump and a Reformed Jew? No?
Yeah. I'm not gonna ruin your joke.
These were the jokes. We have to listen to jokes, are funny. The joke was that only Donald Trump will have grandchildren, Jewish grandchildren. and that was the idea of the campaign. Now, this is, and lo and behold, as the campaign ended, and Donald Trump has been inaugurated, almost in a day, anti-Semitism all over the news. And you said to yourself, what is happening here? What is really the question here? Interestingly enough, 6 months down the road, no one talks about anti-Semitism anymore in America. It was kind of a blip. Anti-Semitism, no anti-Semitism. Is this kind of a wave? Is this kind of like a paranoia? Is this kind of like too much power or the lack of power? These are very important questions that has to be answered. And I think that needs to be done is to understand American Jewry in an historical context. Their fears, their anxieties, the development of what is happening. It's certainly the case that when Donald Trump was inaugurated and he appointed Bannon as a man in his White House, and a man who seemed to be kind of a right-wing, I don't know what the term is, kind of like anti-minorities, anti-Jewish, whatever. So this kind of anxiety, and people attributed also this, how do you call it, in graveyards and all sort of like violations, anti-Semitic violations and so on, to this campaign. At the same time, when I was following also during the campaign, the Sanders campaign, you could see viral hate toward Israel. On the left, viral hate toward Israel. Israel has become sort of the existential subject to be discussed, is why America is moving to the right, which was quite amazing to me. And of course, Sanders himself is a man who was running away from his Judaism, not mentioning his Judaism whatsoever. He's mentioning the Holocaust. His parents are like, this is the Holocaust, something that's there. But he was not mentioning his Judaism, on the contrary. Moving away to mention Israel. Israel is not even on discussion. But Israel, the occupation, is something which is kind of like you can attack in an indirect fashion Jewish American liberals who can constantly have to sit on their knees and say, what's wrong with us? We have to criticize Israel because otherwise we cannot be loyal to the camp. While interesting enough, the right wing is criticizing perhaps Jews who are too cosmopolitan while hailing Israel. everything topsy-turvy world in terms of what's happening. So this needs explanation, how it came about, how deep it runs, or is it sort of like something which is related to the crisis, mega crisis of American Jewry itself, which finds itself in a dwindling community, in a community that doesn't know its designation, identity, with 70+ percentile of intermarriages in terms of identity, in terms of like what informs memory, if it's the Holocaust, it's a history, in terms of the Americanization of religion, which Will Herbert has written about extensively in the 50s. It's very intense relation with Israel over the years because of this, liberalism and so on. Lots of subject to be discussed, and not all of them can make coherent kind of view. Because as I described before, there is a question of the tribe in Judaism, which always came before religion. Don't forget, the tribe of Israel predominates. No rabbi in Israel, the most ultra-Orthodox rabbi in Israel, will ever designate someone who is the most erratic, someone who will never keep kosher, Shabbat, anything, as non-Jewish. Because the tribe comes first. Religion always comes last, second. And that tribal relations, as the ancient Jewish people, as I mentioned, is a very critical thing to refer to, because how it should be maintained, in a sovereign state or in a diasporic nature. And if it's in diasporic nature, how you maintain a community if it's tribal, especially when you join other tribes and then you dilute the whole tribe and the tribe disappears. In America now, people don't know. Goldshire say, maybe there are 8 million Jews because they are a Jewish household. So like if there is if their husband or their wife are Jewish, so we'll designate it as Jewish. But is it really Jewish? Is it not Jewish? The boundaries have been stretched. Well, the boundaries in Israel have not been stretched because Israel has designated primarily along the lines of sovereignty, a nation. And even Russian Jews who are not Jewish, let's say, or were not born to a Jewish mother, very quickly will become part and parcel of the boundaries of the national designation. They will serve in the army, they will speak Hebrew, they will be Israelis. And as Ariel Sharon will say when he hosted former Soviet Russian Jews coming who would not had Jewish mothers, so will not be designated as Jewish by the halacha, he said, you are more Jewish than all those rabbis. And this is from the Prime Minister. Because you defend the land of Israel. Fait accompli. What can you do? So this is something that is happening in the Jewish world, and it has tremendous repercussion to the very discussion on anti-Semitism as well, in terms of what I discussed. So let's move to the question of American Jewry, because this is why I flew over here to discuss. Even though I can discuss many other things and have more passion for them even. American Jewry, ladies and gentlemen, has been created as a massive tribe, mostly in the late 19th century, early part of the 20th century. They are the results in many ways, and this is how you should look at it. That's how I write about them. As part of the transfer of the Jewry from the Russian Empire to the American Empire. That's how it happened. If you look at Sarna's book on Lincoln and the Jews during the Civil War, so there are lots of Jews, but the numbers are not as many. In the thousands, in the 60,000s, all the way up to 500,000. But in the Russian Empire, we have all that is happening in world Jewry, almost with the exception of course, Kehilot, many other places, but that's what happened. In 1903, the Russian Empire, including Poland, of course, has 7 million Jews in the Pale settlements, mostly. Of course, in the cities as well. That's equal, there are many historians here, and like, verging on the cities, but that's what happened. And when they start to move out of Russia, not only because of the pogroms in 1881, under Nikolai I, there was tremendous hardships for Russian Jews. And Nikolai, of course, especially the description of Jews being recruited violently for 25 years and immediately converted to Christianity. You look at Alexander Herzen's memoirs, and how we meet these young kids who are being recruited by the Russian army violently, given as almost sacrificial lamb by the parents because they say give them to them. 10, 12 years old boys. Or march of death. Marching to death overnight. At the end of the morning, they have to kneel and say, would you accept Christianity? They're already dead. And if not, 50% only survive. And that's how Nikolai decided to have Russification of the Jews, because he started to fear the Jews. But when Nikolai dies and his father comes, Alexander II, there's a period of kind of like, I would say, awakening because of the difficulty of the empire. They saw they couldn't do without the Jews. And they had like this tremendous growth. Very quickly, as I described, the Jews can come up from calamity to spring back to life quite quickly. And that was until the assassination of Alexander II, which again shifted life overnight from progression to modernity that you can draw on German example of all the emancipation in Germany that took place at the same time in France. And there's a lesson and something happened. So we started to move to the United States, the Golden Medina. But not only because of that, because of tremendous growth of population. Jewish population grew unbelievably, like the rest of Russian population. The ability to contain diseases and to purify water shifted life. And this was so dense life, and you needed the poverty and so on. People started to move. From 1882 to 1914, about 3.5 million Jews moved to the United States. This is a big number. Anti-Semitism erupted during World War I, in an amazing scale, of course, when Germany invaded Russia. Russians torched land, started to burn the Jews in a way, 500,000 there. And the German later on discovered that they were kind of like maybe dual loyal, all kind of, that's, no one knew. So again, the calamity was always nearby. In the United States, a new paradigm has been established. We have found the Golden Medina. Who has created the notion of the melting pot? Who invented it?
It was the author, a Jewish author of the theater play.
Yes, it's
Yeah.
Srolik Zangvi. Israel Zangvi wrote the theater play.
But Ernest Renaud used
Huh?
it before. Ernest Renaud.
He used the term.
1881.
He used the
He
term.
invented the term.
He used the term, absolutely, thank you for, yeah. But the play popularized the term, yes. And the president came, and here Israel Zangvi. And Earth in Berlin, America the Beautiful. Jews kind of like, this was amazing, what is happening. And what is happening is that they got also a genius leader at the time that grew up to a German family in the 19th century, but became, what coming of age and became so prominent was, of course, Mr. Brandeis, the Supreme Court judge. And Mr. Brandeis understood very well the tremendous contribution of American Jewry into the future, while at the same time he noticed what is happening, this Soviet Jews coming, or Russian Jews coming to fearing even that, and started to recognize Zionism. To be a good Zionist is to be a good American. To be a good American is to be a good Zionist. What an amazing statement he made. This duality has been created. Of course, America predominates. America is the place. And the hate of the Jews was in the margin, of course. If you think about World War I, the Ku Klux Klan is the #1, of course, organization at the time, 5 million members. Of course, the American blacks are the one who are always the subjects of assault by the Ku Klux Klan, #1. In that respect, anti-Semitism in the United States was always coming as a second, so to speak, to the hate of the blacks, or to the designation of the blacks as a lower race in the United States. Secondly, of course, the United States didn't have much liking to the Catholics. So Protestants could bring with them some degree of passion for the Holy Land, for the Jews, for the narrative of the ancient Jews. They always like to talk about the ancient Jews. Interestingly enough, one thing which I just published, you can see in the international, they call the international Review of International Studies. It's an international journal, just published it last month. A big essay I worked with another colleague of mine for 2-3 years. And we worked and we looked at how the people at the Westphalia moment, Westphalia is 1634, the designation of states as a result of the end of the 30-year war, which kind of destroyed Europe in that respect. And so the people of Westphalia was trying to create peace, and it was a Christian peace. And how they called the Christian peace? Based on the ancient Jewish people. You look at that. You can look at my essay. Each and one of them in England here, the discussion of the Protestant, without any kind of like anti-Semitic remarks. Looking at the sovereignty as a tribute to the Jews, they know how to build it. Ancient Jews, that's how they did it. So too in the United States. They were kind of like suspect here and there, but there was no, if you look at Sarna's history, and Sarna did the big service to Jewish American history, you don't see massive sort of anti-Semitism. Because, perhaps, of the racial component of American history, which always overwhelmed all other kind of designation of other minorities, let alone because when the other minorities have moved. 19th century America feared most, of course, Catholics. The potato blight that brings Irish to America is the great danger. It's not the Jewish danger. The Jews are in the margins. So we don't have, in that respect, anti-Semitism in an intense fashion. More so, the very fact that Jewish Americans have very quickly moved to rotate the German type of Judaism, which has been destroyed in Germany. Hermann Cohen still trying to preserve it on the eve of World War I, when he still believes that the Kantian Jewish kind of like mixture can happen, which is quite remarkable. The idea that the Jews have optimism shows also how calamity can come, because they have kind of like maintain optimism all the way to the moment of death. To the moment of death, you can maintain optimism and you die. And this is a big debate in Jewish history. There is the theological debate, and then the Zionist debate. The Zionists say, you know, we don't wait anymore for this Messiah stuff. Let's do things. It's irrelevant, the theological interpretation. They moved away from religiosity. So the American-German sort of like interpretation became so predominant. Liberal Judaism becomes so important in terms of also understanding America. If you think about the major Jewish organization from the late 19th century to early part of the 20th century, they're all universal organizations. I wrote all about them. The American Jewish Congress, B'nai B'rith, the Avad Yehudi Amerikai, AJC, David Harris's organization, massive organization. They all took upon human rights in America, minority rights. They built on that. They were pride of not just representing the Jews, and still represent the Jews as part of like advancing pluralist America. Making the Jewish case not as a tribal, but as universal. American Jewry prided itself of moving the Jewry into the universal designation. The designation of the melting pot, of sort of a national, the assimilationist model of America created by this literature of the Jews. But the Jews also created the idea of pluralism in America. Horace Kellan. The whole idea of pluralism was created at the same time. When America started to think about transnational nations during World War I, when they designated the Germans as potential traitors because of a Zimmerwald sort of telegram, and wanted them to erase the hyphen and the umlaut. The Jews kind of like look at the model and say, okay, pluralist model. Because religious Judaism, which moved directly from the shtetls in Russia to the shtetls of Lower East Side, very quickly also dissipated in America. And they moved, and they succeeded. And they could become part and parcel of the society. And they wanted to become liberal Jews, and Reform Judaism grew and prospered in America. later on Reconstructionist and conservative Judaism and so on, but it's part and parcel. What Will Herber called it, the triple melting pot. How religion melts into the American creed, which is the American creed is Americanization. Americanization takes over religiosity. And in that respect, there was no room for sovereignty. They went against Brandeis. The Jews are a religious group, light religion, part of America. America is our golden Medina. We don't recognize the Jews as a nation because a homeland is for a nation, and we are not. And Zionism was threatening in that respect. All of this time, of course, the Jews were still not part of the American club. One should not underestimate this. They were away. And they were away all the way to the 60s, perhaps, as many other groups were away. Dan Oren, in his book, Joining the Club, and the story of Yale, how professors could not be serving and so on and so forth. That's why they created the new school in New York. And so the Jews were excluded. But there was not an exclusion, it was violent exclusion. It was anti-Semitism and sort of propagated sort of in the society in America. It still is in some respect in terms of groupings. It didn't have a violent situation. The question of African American and Black America at the time is a completely different story in American history. And Jewish American, not by mistake, have been in the forefront in fighting with African American in the 60s, in the end of the Civil War, saying, you know, this is the fault line. And therefore, in the same time in the 60s, they would be blamed when they became sort of like affiliated with Israel. Malcolm X versus Martin Luther King Jr. So there's always give and take. How much universal can be, how much particularistic it can be. There's always a tension there, the way others are looking at you. And when they say universalistic, they want you to give up on the Judaism. In the end of the day, you give up on the Judaism, or you make it so light that you don't know what is Judaism. It's a church. Well, what kind of a church? We don't know. In Germany, said just like erase it. What do you need it for? So just convert altogether. Because in any case, you despise religion, right? With modernity. Judaism in the United States, therefore, evolved as a successful sort of Jewish community. It took time. It's a large community. At the time, it used to be, I forgot the numbers, but almost, I would say, 5% of the population, or maybe less, maybe I'm wrong. Think about it, at the beginning of the 20th century, there were in America, as far as you can Google it, about 100 million people. So the Jews were maybe 3%. Huh?
I didn't hear you, I'm sorry.
I said 3%, more or less. I don't want to make mistakes here, but you can Google it. I think there were 110 million Americans at that time, if my memory doesn't fail me. And suddenly the Jews were a big community. Going fast forward is this question of what happened. And what happened is that the Jewish experience, of course, was overwhelmed eventually by the events of the Holocaust. The failing of the Jews, the abandonment of the Jews, what's his name's book?
Wyman.
David Wyman's book, The Abandonment of the Jews. This is a drama of tremendous proportion of Jewish Americans. How we could have let it go. How we sat still. How we did nothing. Hillel Kook sort of like, demonstrations. Nothing. How we have abandoned the Jews of Europe. What type of Jewish community we are if you have no power whatsoever. Again, what does it mean, Jewish power? Zero. They slaughter our people completely, and we were sitting here fearing to be designated as people who are pushing America into a war that America didn't want. That's exactly what happened. And that trauma has been informing American Jewish life ever since in many ways, even though it's dissipating again. In fact, on the eve of World War II, you had spikes of anti-Semitism because they are kind of like charging the Jews for having sort of like this kind of like attempt to push America into a war. Throughout the 20s and the 30s, when America is dealing with other issues, including the big economic crisis, in America, kicking out Mexicans across the board. The Jews somewhat navigating the ship, prospering, building communities, gradually entering jobs in the government and perhaps universities and so on. Post-Holocaust is a big time for American Jewry, like for all Americans. It's a big time in American Jewry in terms of the realization of the colossal failure of power. And on the eve of that, kind of like, there's still debates. Memorial troubles to the United States, trying to recruit the United Golda Meir troubles, as you very well know, eventually. And Zionism is the vehicle through which American Jewry starts to mobilize. Holocaust, of course, Memorial is the second component, if not the first of the kind. If you ask yourself, and ask yourself right now, I will ask you a question. Who is a Jewish role model in America? Give me one.
Woody Allen.
I rest my case. I rest my case. This is all Sandy Koufax, who knows the name? Only those who love baseball, like me. But who knows? Give me one Jewish notable. One. I'm not saying for 10. One Jewish notable. Don't give me Rabbi Kaplan and Rabbi Soloveitchik and all the big guys. Give me one. One. I shock you, right? I do this exercise everywhere in the world. They know nothing about them, because there is none. Interesting enough. Huh?
Brandeis?
Brandeis is exactly 100 years ago. 100 years ago, Brandeis. Saul Bellow is dead.
Rod is not there.
Yeah? Huh?
Yeah.
What's that?
Rod.
Philip Roth. But again, you're talking to me about many years ago. You don't know. Interesting enough, think about it. The last one you mentioned before was Elie Wiesel. Elie Wiesel was sort of like the last sort of bastion of the Holocaust memory. He was the sine qua non, moral rod, sort of like lightning rod of America. And he positioned himself, the Holocaust was positioned himself as the lightning rod of America, to the point that all this literature who said that there is a Holocaust industry. Here it's all the Holocaust, and what about others? You know, like this was the discussion. Elie Wiesel had this kind of like, when something happening, the president called Elie Wiesel to consult with him. And he came with this baggage of the Holocaust and the humanist ideology. Now you don't know who is being called upon. And certainly not because he or she is Jewish. It's a very important transformation. Post-Holocaust Jewry is a very important time. They took time, like the Israelis, to recognize the Holocaust until the Eichmann trial. The Eichmann trial kind of like shoot everything into the air. And this is 1960-61. Because you build, you move into suburbs. Jews are building, they are prospering, building into suburbs. Anti-Semitism is no longer fashionable. Even discussing about anti-Semitism after the Nazi atrocities. You start to open a little bit. The civil rights movement is in conjunction with that. The Jews marching in Selma and so on was African American leadership. And then came, of course, the Israelization moment of America. But the Israelization moment of all of American Jewry and all of Jews everywhere, and this is the designation we'll write about, the 67 war. Israel suddenly becoming the mega star of the world. In 6 days, dismantle all the Arab sort of armies, managing to overcome another fear of colossal victimhood of a Holocaust magnitude of the 6-day war. And suddenly Israel emerging as this kind of victorious. A new Jew has been created. American Jews no longer have to hide their Judaism. They can be proud. They can be tribal again. They can have new interpretation which brings nationalism and tribalism into the fore. They can create chavurot, groups, all sorts of like new American Jewish religiosity. Americans, and the world is looking to Israelis, this is no longer what they call in Yiddish the nebuch. The Jews are always kind of like, cannot do anything, running away from all those who are abusing them. Here we have Jews who are fighting for life and winning. This is something new. Winning big time. And this changes the whole idea of power and powerlessness. They may be too powerful. The discourse is changing. America is becoming friends. Keep in mind, when in the 50s, only a few years before, American Jews were leery about their alliance with Israel. People forget that. When Jacob Blaustein who was a massive Jewish leader at the time, the people knew who was Jacob Blaustein. The American Jewish Committee leader, come to talk to Ben Gurion, and he tells Ben Gurion, you don't call us exiles. We are American. We have motherland. Because Ben Gurion called all the Jews in the world exiles. You know, Zionism is trying, in 48, everybody should come here. And Ben Gurion retreats. He said, American Jews have their homeland. We don't call on them exiles or diaspora. They are our brothers and sisters there. We don't want to interfere. When during the Suez War in 1956, the American administration of Eisenhower calls on Israel to retreat, and Israel is trying to recruit American Jewry. American Jewry tells Israel, hold your horses. Don't involve us in dual loyalty. The question of dual loyalty, which becomes such an important component in the idea of anti-Semitism. Do you have dual loyalty? It's not to your tribe, it's not to the state of Israel. And the dual loyalty component has become part and parcel of the discourse. You know, it kind of like becomes so much part of also the African American discourse in the 60s. When African Americans said, you are now more loyal to Israel than to the cause of the inclusion of African Americans. There's always, the way you behave, either as a tribal or universal, you are in trouble. This is something you have to think about. This tension between universalism and particularism of Jews, which nourishes anti-Semitism and gives it a different twist in each time. Is it a cabal, so that the Jews were united, or is it a separation? The Jews are separated. Two different stories. Historically speaking, the Jews themselves didn't know how to deal with it. They wanted to move away. All the history of the modern Jewry is the history of Jews wanting to move away from Judaism. This is the history. Escaping Judaism. If it's the Bund in Russia, in Poland, just designate himself as a tribe, maybe, after the Kahal, socialists. And Lenin comes to him and said, how can you be particularist and being socialist? So he charges them. Or liberals, which is inventing sort of the individual at the expense of the Kahal. Or Reform Judaism, we said, okay, this is like a church. Every aspect of modern Judaism, with one exception, Zionism. Zionism said, we will be melting if we could, as Herzl said, but we cannot. They will still designate it because it will be racial. So let's have a state. And the state will give us a nationalist designation, rather than a communal, spiritual, whatever designation, let alone religious one. This is the shift that happened. And that will be the shift that will happen also in the designation of anti-Semitism. I'm not discussing at all the Muslim and Arab war, which will take shape only after the Zionism erupts. And it begins, if you look, at what's his name, Mitchell's book on the Arab, on the Islamic Brotherhood, Al-Banna, in the 20s. He talks about it. Richard Mitchell's books. Richard Mitchell's book's a brilliant book. Richard Mitchell. His son, Josh Mitchell, has written a brilliant book also, which is called The Tocqueville in Arabia, which is a very interesting book you should read. He's a scholar of Tocqueville. But Richard Mitchell shows sort of like how this kind of like, because you see with the Mufti brings anti-Semitism into a new phase, because the Mufti is going to meet with Hitler. But this is later. In the American Jewish community, the Holocaust, of course, is a watershed. The vulnerabilities, the losses, the family ties, the fact that the abandonment, as we talked about, Wyman's sort of like title. But as happened with Jewish world, they had to go through the sort of like World War II, open up the Jewish life in America. Lots of barriers have been lifted. They can move very fast into the suburbia, creating new communities, celebrating all the JCCs in the world, moving into academia. At the same time, Israel was created. Israel was an interesting development, and of course garnered support and all sort of like, but it was not yet massive. Israel was created. I don't have time.
You don't have to.
5 minutes. I will wrap it up and that's what happened when you, as you say, time flies when you enjoy, time flies when they suffer. But basically, let's move fast forward. Jews have been part and parcel of the American discourse on anti-Semitism, and it was in stages. The alliance with American Jews in America and American Jews in Israel has been a massive development, which consolidated only later. People forget that AIPAC, for example, was created much. America didn't have relation with Israel initially. They recognized the state of Israel, but they wanted to have the Baghdad Pact. It was much more likely that the Baghdad Pact will survive than Israel. They call it premature recognition. So only in 1958 AIPAC is assembling, but it was a very small group. 73 is when America sort of assisted to Israel by Nixon. Nixon used to have anti-Semitic slurs supporting Israel. So they said, okay, anti-Semitic slurs. Israel could tell us, give us the weapons. What the heck if Trump has some anti-Semitic slurs? Give us the weapons. As he said, anti-Semitism, you hate the Jews more than necessary, big deal. We are powerful. Bibi comes to you and say, you will not survive if we are not your partner. So what is that? Kind of arrogance of sorts. But what happened is that the Israelization of anti-Semitism is creeping into the American left very much. And it's creeping in very rapidly because you could not find enemies in the universal term. Think about the world we live in. No ideology whatsoever. Show me one designation of a nation that speaks about values right now. Any nation. Another conundrum. Any nation just speaks about values. It's kind of like the 90s, the globalization, liberalism. Who is espousing global values right now? Think about it also. It's a good exercise for the afternoon. Among the Jewry, of course, they were trying to capture certain moments. They captured the moment of the war against the Soviet Union. The moment was, of course, with the Jackson-Winnick Amendment of releasing American Jews, Russian Jews from Russia. It was part of the American victory over the Soviet Union. So this was kind of like injecting it. The idea of the Holocaust as part of what we call universal memory. The Holocaust Museum is now the museum, is the place where most Americans vote. And this is called take it away from the particularism of Israelis, of the Jews, to the universal. And that's a danger, because if it's universal, it's no longer particular. So the experiences are mixed. Second, of course, is what is happening with the Israelis and Palestinians. How much Israel is universal, how much is democratic? The language has shifted. I think under the Obama administration, you could see, and the Democrats and the liberals in America, so gradually moving, there was always kind of like an alliance between America and Israel. Every conference you have in America, we are twin brothers. We have strategic interests and we have values. Always we talk about these two pillars. Israel is an extension of America. Israel is the only country that celebrates Independence Day with American flags. Where can America find patriots like that? Where? Think about it. America find patriots like that, like in Israelis. They love America. Everywhere you go, they hate America. You come here, America, but they love America. It's something. So they had this kind of. But in the last few years, or in the last, so like there's a whole discussion whether Israel is deviating from its liberal creed. And the Obama administration also had this idea of Israel moving away from universal Judaism, which took over America. Tikkun olam. What is Tikkun olam? Repairing the world. It's the new ideology of universalism. You have to do it for the world, but can you maintain your communities? Hardly can maintain your community. And Israel is particularistic. It is not by mistake when Obama lit the candles in Hanukkah. He said, we are all Jews. we despise anti-Semites here and there, but we are all Jews. We are all Jews in what sense? Judaism is not a tribe. Judaism is a universal creed. And if it's a universal creed, what do we do with this national state, which is certainly a particularistic one? And that kind of brings sort of like this criticism. I will stop, I'll take questions, I have so much to say, but I will not confuse you more.
It was amazing tour de force.
I don't know how amazing it was confusing.
No,
Amazing.
it was amazing. I can ask you 60 questions, but I'm going to be brief. I'll just ask you one. Growing up in Canada, in the shadow of the United States, I always perceived the American Jewish community as being much larger, much more powerful, much more organized than the Canadian Jewish community. And also being Israeli. I've lived in the United States now for one. And I'm shocked by the level of assimilation, this notion of as being the essence of Judaism, not a part of it, etc., etc. You mentioned Andy Wyman's book on the environment of the Jews. There's a part of the book where he writes about how the American Air Force was 30 seconds away flying time from the railroad tracks of Auschwitz, but because of anti-Semitism, the Americans did nothing, and they abandoned the Jews. I was very involved and engaged in the Holy Land issue.
Yes.
And internationally and in the United States, trying to further, isolate Iran and bring to the fore the dangers of its anti-Semitism and its nuclear weapons program and human rights abuses. And I was amazed and disturbed at how easily the American Jewish community, the established American Jewish community, was intentionally divided by the Obama administration and its supporters, and how I think notions of due loyalty crept into the discourse, and really I think terrified some of the leadership of the Jewish community. So here was a regime that it's ideologically a core element of its ideology, I would argue, is about it's anti-Semitic, but also about incitement to genocide, and its necessity to eradicate the self-determination of Jewish people on Islamic land. And once again, the Jewish power failed to stop the agreement and to stop the slaughter, what's going on in the implosion of the Middle East. Is this sort of, I wouldn't say equal, but is this sort of a traumatic moment in American Jewish community, its notions of power, its notions of...
I think I wrote about it 5 years ago, if you read Na'aretz. I wrote a piece that said the mystique of American Jewish power. There's always discussion about sort of like as if American alliance with Israel related to the Jewish lobby. The Jewish lobby is dead. Dead, I'm telling you. It doesn't exist. What
did you say is dead?
Jewish lobby. What does it mean, the Jewish lobby? You have, of course, American interest, but they are, of course, as you very well know, debated. If you have a president who just left and left a legacy of the deal with Iran, and then there is a presidency, the worst deal ever. Okay, so now you have to deal with this. Everything is the worst or the best. The worst or the best, and you say, okay, what is it? Now the Jews are sitting there, and they have to get Trump into AIPAC's first convention. Some people say, wow! Immediately the leadership of AIPAC come to the fore. I was there, saying, watch it. Said, we shouldn't clap like this. They're worried about too much support for Trump because it was before the elections. So they're divided. What did they mean divided? Jewish Americans are in a very important stage in terms of like how and what is the legacy of our community. There has been an Israelization. Israel is the epicenter. We have difficulty in maintaining our community. The community is divided, deeply divided, on various issues. They're not divided about the Holocaust, the memories, and the need and the desire. There is still the conference of presidents. And people are sitting there and they understand that they have to be careful not to move far away from each other because eventually everybody designates them similarly, notwithstanding their own division. If you look at, what's his name, Putnam's book, American Grace, 2010, heavy book on American religion. You see how he designates American Jews? It's almost like a minor ethnic group. Was it American Judaism? And it talks about religion. So at the same time, American Judaism has become very empowered. In what respect become empowered? They can show themselves as Jews. In what was, you no longer have to hide it. Hillary Clinton's daughter Mary was a Jewish guy. Trump's daughter is converting to Judaism. Kerry's people. Everybody, like, it's part and parcel. Judaism is part of what we call the Christian, what they call the Judeo-Christian tradition. America invented the Judeo-Christian tradition.
Yes.
And then they moved to the Abrahamic. I sit with, what's his name? He was the head of the CIA, the Greek guy. No.
He sat behind,
He was sitting next to me in the comments.
Colin Powell.
No, during the Bush administration.
Thank you.
George Tenet?
George Tenet, thanks.
Yeah,
George Tenet sits next to me, teaches at Georgetown. We have a commencement ceremony. Georgetown, Jesuit school, they're trying to be good to everybody, here and there, constantly lovey-dovey, kumbaya society. Kumbaya society, so they start the commencement ceremony. The first benediction is by a Jewish Israeli girl, I forgot her name, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu haolam, שהגענו לזמן הזה. Final, okay. Then there is the Arab, the Islamic head of the Islamic student, whatever. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Okay, fine. And so George Tenet says, "What the heck is the Christians? It's just Jesuit school. What they have done of it?" I said to him, "George, it's Abrahamic now. It used to be Christian, then it became Judeo-Christian, now it's Abrahamic. Wait for your turn." It's America. It's America. Now, what it means that it's also kind of like, we don't know exactly what it is. So the ultra-Orthodox remain ultra-Orthodox and very powerful. They're not trying to hide anymore. And they fastly grow in America. The religious Zionists, which is sort of like what I call the Orthodox, modern Orthodox Americans, also grow. They have completely intertwined with Israeli religious Zionists. If it's Yeshiva University and others, they had some crisis during the Oslo Agreement and so on. But eventually it's sort of like, this is what it is. They don't have to hide, and America don't have to hide anymore. But the liberals have to think, how do they designate their identity? If it's intermarriages, if it's sort of like, how do you maintain? You have to work very hard. Think about it. To maintain communities, you have to work very hard. When I go for services, which I don't go to Israel, but I go when I'm in New York, and so you see the services in the new shul in New York. They make a huge effort to bring people, because there is no community. How do you maintain communities? Judaism is all about community. If you don't have community, you don't have a community. So oftentimes you organize along the Israeli line, because it's good to, on any side. I go with this group, liberal American Jewish women, B'tzedek v'Shalom, which means justice and peace. And they go to Seattle, I go to speak, they want to raise money to evacuate the settlers. And I said, what other Jewish activities do you have? She said, what do you mean? This is what we do, because this is what it is. When I see Ben Ami is the guy who runs the organization J Street. J Street it's an organization which was created to advocate Israel withdrawal, whatever it is. And I invited to the house of Shimon Shamir, who was the ambassador to Cairo, and he said, J Street leader is coming, and we discuss. And he tells me, like the Hamas Palestinian alliance was coming to the fore after the war in 2011, was that, I forgot when was the last war, and so the Hamas and Palestine were trying to come together again. So he said, I'm going to see Hamas leader now. I said, wow, Israel don't speak to them, you can get to Gaza to speak to them. He said, I'll try to do. So I said, what other Jewish activities do you have? He said, what do you mean? I said, what do you mean you go to talk to Hamas? Who designated you to talk to Hamas? Are you the Israeli government? Shimon Shamir said, I think we had enough for tonight. We had to go. The dinner was gone. Israel is a subject you have to organize around, otherwise what else you will organize if you're not religious? Think about it. What else? If you don't have ethnicity, and American ethnicity has been dissipating fast. Religiosity has been dissipating fast. So you have Israel either as an opponent or as a proponent. But nevertheless, it's the issue. Or the Holocaust. But the Holocaust, I don't know if dissipating fast, but it's dissipating. It's a universal memory. So you become more and more in trouble in maintaining communities. And that's a big challenge.
Any questions? Russ?
Oh, actually, I just had a quick comment. You were asking earlier about prominent Jews in American society. 3 members of the U.S. Supreme Court are Jewish.
Yes, I absolutely agree. But,
But that's just an example.
just an example. I'm not saying, they are Jewish,
Yes.
but they are not members of the Jewish community in the same manner.
Okay.
You see what, that's exactly what I mean.
Okay.
When Ruth Baden, of course they're Jewish. I'm not saying, there are 10 members of the American Senate, 10 Jewish members. But they are members, not because they're Jewish members, they are members. Bernie Sanders is a Jew. He doesn't want to be there, but he's Jewish. But that is not designating him as a voter.
Alan Dershowitz.
And Dershowitz is a very important figure. Absolutely. Ellen Dershowitz will be the one who will attack American Jews for thinking that Trump is anti-Semite. You saw it. Criticize it. Say, no, it's not. And Ellen Dershowitz is becoming such a prominent because of his relation with Israel. His relation with Israel is the primary sort of like identity of saying, you know, like, of course he's well-known, but he certainly warned himself, you know, like, in defense of Israel, this is what he did. Ellen Dershowitz wrote the book Chutzpah in the early 90s, which was a massive kind of like, we are coming of age, the Jews. Now we should speak. Before it was used to be Shande. Shande sort of like Shain, sort of like, we don't want to be there. We don't want to be seen. Now we want to be seen. Jewish powerfulness. And suddenly, September 11 came, and the Jews were on the defense again. David Harris wrote, we were mugged. We were mugged of our power. Because the Jews suddenly in Israel was designated in Durban as the most violating, sort of like human rights country. Out of the blue, anti-Semitism exploding. You say, why? All the conspiracy theory that the Israelis conducted there. Suddenly people woke up and said, wow, we thought we have arrived. And suddenly we are not. Anti-Semitism is there. It's always there, but we tend to forget it.
So I've got 2 not so very related questions. The first,
As quickly as you can, we're running out of time.
all right, quickly as I can. Thank you for charting the map. Brilliant lecture. When you talk about the rights discourse, I was wondering if you have sort of explored relations between American Jews and Quakers. You know, with related to rights discourse, particularly in the East Coast. So that's one part of the question.
The Jewish with the Quakers.
Jews and the Quakers.
I know very little about it.
Okay, all right. And, all right, I'll leave the,
I really don't know much about it, so I don't want to make it.
okay.
Thank you for your illuminating talk. I really appreciate it. I especially enjoyed the part where you discussed Israelization and the African American community.
Yeah.
So there are just a couple of things I just wanted to throw into, perhaps to amplify that from some things I've been considering as well. One is it might be interesting to consider also at the same time the rise in black nationalism.
Yes.
How that
Yes.
worked vis-a-vis the Israeli kind of particularism.
Yeah.
And also this really kind of touchy subject of maybe the new, this new view in the West and sometimes in the black community, and I would argue sometimes in some members of the Jewish community, of perceiving Jews as white, right? And how that would play in the conversation between blacks in the liberation struggle, in the 60s particularly. And finally, how this connects to policy, in particular to affirmative action policy.
Yeah.
That was a very curious dynamic. We had those that coalition, that pre-1964 Civil Rights Coalition, which focused on, as Nathan Glazer and others talk about, you know, non-discrimination, color blindness, right? But then we had these fissures with regard to color consciousness, and suddenly this very, very thorny issue of this idea of quotas, right, which have been used very differently in the Jewish community, and which now has found itself in the language of affirmative action policy.
Yeah, and this is of course what you're describing, which is important. I didn't discuss so many things. Of course, this is already itself over 50 years now. This debate was Nathan Glazer and David and Moynihan and so on. The whole idea of the civil rights movement which was sort of like for the Jewish, sort of like, so the neoconservative school started to emerge in that respect. This was also an important moment. And the big question was at the time about the alliance with African Americans, so the civil rights movement. On the one hand, you have the alliance with Martin Luther King, then there is the question of the Jewish, sort of like, should we accept quotas that now prevents from us, what's the name, the guy joining the club, should we wait, why should we now designate as whites, because we have not been accepted also. All of these debates have gone a long time ago. The memories of scholars, and the new generations don't have any understanding of that. This was sort of a period of the civil rights movement. Six-Day War took place, changed the equation. Then there was, of course, the question of African American and the Third World. That was an important juncture. African American and the Third World became important because the PLO at the time became the champion of the Third World. Yasser Arafat sort of became the spokesperson of the sort of the glories of the Third World. Don't forget the ambassador to the United Nations, what's his name, from Atlanta? Andrew Young crisis, with Jimmy Carter. So Andrew Young sort of like, and that became sort of like, everything which was done sort of like as if he was, the criticism of Andrew Young became a criticism of African American in a top job. And that later on was with Jesse Jackson, the Jesse Jackson ideology that came and so on, and Israel field, especially with the Arab and the Third World. But Third World also crushed. No one remembered the Third Worldism. Remember, Third Worldism was in the 60s. Gamal Abdel Nasser was the head of the African American Unity Organization because the Arab nationalism. Who remembers Arab nationalism? As someone just told me, he said, an Egyptian scholar came to me and said, "Where are you guys?" I said, "I'm in Georgetown." He said, "Georgetown? You still teach Arab nationalism? Only at Georgetown do you think Arab nationalism still exists?" And I was laughing, because in the Middle East, no one believed Arab nationalism still exists in that respect. In the old days. It crushed in that respect. And he said to me about Georgetown, things have evolved so fast in the Middle East. Evolved so fast. But these memories, of course, exist. It's the memories of the old generation. Ask young people. Ask the young people, those who tweet and those who Facebook and so on. They feel under assault on campuses with the BDS. Jewish Americans, sort of like with Hillel and so on, they try to see where they are. They don't know where they are. They don't understand even the story. It's an old story already. The older generation feels sort of like assaulted by sort of Israel's decisions about Reform Judaism, conservative, with the ultra-Orthodox. This is the big questions. And all the others is how to maintain communities.
So we're going over time, so Rami, and then the last question to Larry.
Quick question, because it's very important to me to listen to answer from you because I'm from the region. You said that Jewish lobby in the United States has become less influence now over the
Yes.
What does it mean for the future of Israel? Because we as Arab, not me, but all the Arab people thought that Israel is the hidden power behind Israel, and also, you know, the conservatives.
Yes. Look, anyone who lives in Israel, at least me, I don't want to speak for anyone, it's a ridiculous idea to say anyone, me, understands that Israel is, as I said, I think you left when I described Israel as the fastest growing population in the Western world. Israel has this amazing relation with India, we have people from India here, amazing relation with China, the most prosperous GDP per capita, 40,000 a year. Of course, GDP per capita. But Israel's big debate is about what type of Israel. It's going to be modernized Israel or Haredi Israel. This is the big issue of Israel. The second volume of my book is about Israel itself. It's not about the Odyssey. Powerful enough, Israel is powerful. It's powerful not because of the Jewish lobby. It's, there is a strategic alliance. The Americans understand the strategic alliance. You can say anything about the Obama administration. No one can blame the Obama administration for undercutting their strategic alliance. The Americans kept the strategic alliance. They had criticism of Israel, Kerry had criticism, Obama had criticism, c'est la vie. But they understood Israel's position is critical for it. Because they see the Middle East, countries are in shambles, Lebanon doesn't exist as a state. Syria doesn't exist as a state. Iraq barely exists as a state. Jordan is so vulnerable. Egypt has had its own upheavals from the Tahrir Square to Sisi's. So Israel is so Israel is now whether this fact that the American jury will not be powerful will it impact voting? I don't know what is impacting voting now in Washington. I've been in Washington for too long to understand that there is gridlock. Voting, look at every day. I look at it every day what's happening with the Obamacare changes. Yes, changes, not changes. And at the same time you have 100 senators signing for Israel. They didn't sign for Israel because of the Jewish lobby. They understand there is some degree of stability somewhere, and Israel is stability for America. Now, Jewish Americans don't like so much this stability. It's interesting enough. So when it came the idea of the Iran, you asked me about the Iran, so the Jewish American were divided. If we vote for, because Bibi seems so aggressive, and he was so aggressive, and he came to Congress because he had to have a show to speak to Americans as if he's the president of America. That is not working like that. Americans understood that certain degrees that you don't do. You take a step back. So the administration thought, and eventually people didn't say, well, I will not vote against my own administration, let alone when you have the head of the Mossad, the head of the Shabbat, the head coming to the United States and say, it's not such a big deal. So it's become confused. But if they will feel the heat again, that something will happen, and they will see the instinctive understanding of an assault will be there. The question how many Jews will remain at that time because of assimilation. How much you can garner instincts in the absence of a community. That's a big question for Israel. They don't know. They don't know. But the dangers, you come from the Middle East, may be there, whatever. I don't think it will be, the question is whether the gravity of geopolitics have rotated somewhere. We had this visit, I think people have not paid attention, of the Prime Minister of India to Israel, which was 2 weeks ago, a week ago, 2 weeks ago. India used to be the leading partner of the third worldism against Israel. You have Mr. Modi coming to Israel, and you see this kind of like, it's mind-boggling. It's a shift of empowerment of a different nature. And there is no anti-Semitism. On the contrary, what they have in the East, not in China. You go to China, they tell you, oh, you Jews much more smarter than the rest of the world. So don't say that. It's positive anti-Semitism. I don't want to hear that. Like we don't. This is something you don't say, things like that. But they say it. It's okay. God forbid, people will hear it. It's something different. It's a language you don't use. It's kind of like it's not PC, but that's how they speak, or in Japan and so on. So it's confusing.
Okay, so last quick.
I'm going to pass it 5 minutes late.
No, quick question.
Do you think AIPAC is powerless? Is that the
I
conclusion?
didn't say AIPAC is powerless, but I think AIPAC is not as powerful. Because what does it mean to be powerful? Powerful, as we teach in political science, what is power? Power is to make A to do a certain thing he wouldn't otherwise do if you wouldn't push him to do it. I don't see anyone can push the Trump administration to do what they don't want. Everybody's leery in the Middle East. Don't irritate them, because this guy can be irritated so much. And I don't see, and Charles said, we saw the 2 cases of American foreign policy, the 2 single cases of American foreign policy. One was the Iran deal. Total failure. Total failure. And of course, the Obama administration, the last months, condemning Israel in the Security Council. No one stopped anything. There is big talk. But you have to understand also, I wrote about it also, to say I wrote about it is kind of like ridiculous to say, but I did write about it, about this whole thing, about the bureaucratic aspect of lobbying. Bureaucratic aspect, lobbies have to exist. So they have to trump their own cards and so on and so forth. But how much power there is always a big question. The real power, so like, I tell you, you do this. Some people still believe they have power, which is good. They like to encourage that. They tend to encourage it, to think, like I remember once, this is my last point, sitting in was a big, massive American organization, and he said, I said, wow, you have beautiful offices. So this guy, we sit in front of his offices, and from his office, we see the Washington Post. He said, we build a Jewish conspiracy. I said, what do you mean they build? We bring guests from abroad, we take them to this window and say, why, they also control the Washington Post. Great, they're powerful Jews. If they think we are so powerful, at least they will see something from our window. This is a bureaucratic sort of like, yeah. Okay.